Hey everybody, this week we're going to talk a bit about free black society in the North. And I just want to, before I get going here, make sure my sound is good. Okay. Um, yeah, so we're going to talk about a topic this week that I think is a little bit overlooked sometimes when we think about early African American history. Um, which makes sense, right? The vast majority of African American people in the early United States were enslaved. The vast majority of them lived in the southern states. But there is a really important side of this story, which is people who are not enslaved, right? People who live in this part of the country that describes itself as the free states. So I want to dig into that. And you'll remember last week, just to quickly rehash, we talked about this great transition, this massive transition in American slavery from the sort of mixture of slave societies and societies with slaves that are sort of intermixed and they're overlapping to a more rigid division where in the South you have slave societies, which are growing, which are economically and politically very powerful, which have enormous populations of enslaved people and which are increasingly devoted to cotton as well as to the domestic slave trade, the Second Middle Passage, which is how enslaved people are moving from places like Virginia, South Carolina, Kentucky, down to places like Louisiana and Texas. And we also talked a bit about this process called gradual emancipation, right? After the American Revolution, we have slavery ending formally in these new northern states. Sometimes it's really rapid, like in Massachusetts. Sometimes it's very slow, like in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, where enslaved people end up living in those states for decades because the way the laws are written. Um, and you'll remember that I described that as philanthropy at bargain prices, right? It was a way for these new states to sort of live up to some of their constitutional mandates that all people are born equal, that all people deserve equal opportunity in life, right? These kind of revolutionary ideas, but without having to upset any economically powerful people in their states who might own slaves. Okay, so that all sets the ground for the creation of a so-called Free North. So before we dig into what the Free North was all about, what free black society looked like in the North, let's just run through a couple of quick terms. The only term here that's especially relevant for this class is abolitionism. And the other two are just going to help you understand the lecture a little bit more. So abolitionists, they are the opponents of slavery. They want to destroy slavery. They believe that slavery is immoral, and they express concern for the humanity of enslaved people in the United States. Okay, this is an important distinction. Suggesting that slavery is immoral doesn't necessarily imply that one also believes enslaved people's interests matter or that enslaved people should have some sort of equal station in the country. There's plenty of anti-slavery people in the United States, all the way through the Civil War, who did not really care about the welfare of enslaved people. Okay, they thought maybe slavery was immoral because it challenged non-slaveholding whites' economic or political power. Or they thought it was immoral, but they really weren't that concerned about what happened to enslaved people after emancipation, and they thought perhaps they could export the problem away by sending people to Africa or something like that. Okay, abolitionists in general have a more humane perspective than that, and they want to promote the welfare of not only enslaved people, but also free people of color. Um, so these are sort of foundational ideas in 19th century politics. Um, Abolitionists were pretty radical for their time. Most Northerners were not abolitionists, but abolitionists still managed to play an important role in like mainstream politics, even though they have radical ideas, and they play an important role in the founding of the Republican Party, which I'm going to talk about next week as we move towards the Civil War. And at the end of this lecture, I'm going to talk a bit about some of their legacies in Black politics, even into the 20th century, even into the 21st century. Antebellum is just a description of a period in American history. This term's been in the news lately, I suppose. So all it really means when historians use it is roughly the period from about 1820 to 1860. It's a period that's defined by what's called the sectional crisis, conflict between North and South, which just gets worse and worse and worse throughout the period. It's defined by the question of slavery sort of dominating national politics. And it's defined by the role of cotton in the American economy. And then Jim Crow. Jim Crow is a term that historians use and just Americans in general use to describe two things. And most specifically, what they're describing is it's a synonym for legal racial segregation. So if you've seen pictures from the United States South in, say, the 1950s, that have sort of a designation of a bathroom for white people and then another one for people of color. Right, that's an example of this kind of segregation. But it has also, because of its relationship to Southern segregation, it's come also, I think, to represent a period of time, roughly from the 1890s up until the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, the Jim Crow era, people might say. One of the things you're going to learn in this lecture is that Jim Crow, legal segregation based on race or the perceived race, the way the state or the government perceives the race of different people, did not actually originate in the South in that period. That Southern states were modeling those laws on laws that had actually been created in the North in the decades after the American Revolution. Jim Crow was actually born in Massachusetts and New York. And so the term Jim Crow that I'm going to use a few times in this lecture, I'm really just referring to this kind of legal segregation, but just know the images that you've most likely seen related to the idea of Jim Crow come from much later in a different place, but they have a shared and linked history. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what it means when we talk about free people of color. And I just want to make one quick point before I go any further here, which perhaps will be surprising to people. And if it is, and you're interested in this, I can circulate a short and very readable article by a very famous historian, Henry Louis Gates, about this issue. There were free people of color in the American South always, right? All the way through the Civil War, they existed. They existed more in some places than others, right? Most prominently, they were in cities. If you visited any Southern city in, say, 1850, about just a little more than 10 years before the American Civil War, you would have encountered free people of African descent. This was especially true in a place like New Orleans and in Charleston, right? Some of the bigger cities of the South. And you might have even encountered free people of color who had risen to relatively influential status in their communities. They had some wealth, perhaps, or perhaps they were widely respected as sort of a voice of the Black community. In many cases, those people still lacked really important legal rights. They were likely unable to enter into their own contracts. They would have had to have an agent who did that for them. They likely would have been barred from establishing churches, which had been seen as a way for the Black community to sort of forge an identity and potentially challenge the white community. They would have been barred from testifying in court, but they would have been there, okay? And in some cases, very few cases, but in some cases, they also would have been slaveholders, right? This is a slave society. Wealthy people in slave societies tend to own slaves. It was not impossible, even in the 1840s and 50s, when Southern slavery was at its most sort of powerful, its pinnacle, of influence in its most white supremacist moment, that a few free people of color owned slaves. And I would be happy to follow up more about that with all of you. The reason I bring it up right now, though, is to suggest that freedom for people of African descent in the 19th century in the Atlantic world could look dramatically different from one place to another. And it depended on the conditions of that place, right? It depended on political circumstances. It depended on economic circumstances. Is it a cash crop economy or not? What is the cash crop? How influential is that cash crop in shaping the global economy? All of these things affected to what extent people of color could actually control their lives, whether or not they were free. An example, in Brazil, slavery actually lingered until 1888. It's the last place in the Western Hemisphere, the last major government to ban slavery. But there's a many decades long process where it's really not that significant anymore, right? It's gradually collapsing. And that's because the Brazilian sugar industry was gradually collapsing, which meant that slaveholders who directed that industry were losing political influence, they were losing economic influence, which meant that enslaved people were increasingly finding themselves freed of their slavery, but with little opportunity to capitalize on that freedom. This is radically different than, say, in the American South, right? Southern slaveholders were never more powerful than on the eve of the American Civil War. There was more money invested in enslaved people. Cotton was making more money in the late 1850s than it ever had. And so slavery in the United States was destroyed very rapidly, right? It's like a great shock to the system. It's very different than the Brazilian case. And as we said, it is never completely dominant in the North, and it only gradually dies out there and has very little effect on the society. So it looks different from place to place. That's probably not surprising. It's one of the major themes I've been hammering all semester. But just as slavery differed from place to place, so too did freedom, right? So in many places, the relative freedom of African descended people depended on the color of their skin, on their complexion. Okay, this is especially true in Brazil, in Cuba, in New Orleans. These are places that had sort of large enslaved populations, but also relatively large free, I hesitate to call them black populations because that's not how they understood themselves, but free populations of color, which meant that there were people who had sort of black descendants, or they were the descendants of Africans as well as Europeans, and they sort of retained a European identity. In those societies, darker skinned people tended to be enslaved. So color was reflective of class status. And this wasn't just like a matter, again, of like sorting people when they're born based on their color into one class or another. It was a product of history. These are Creole societies, and the descendants of the Creoles refused to propagate with African-born enslaved people over time. And so you just have these patterns, these cultural patterns that create two distinct classes of people. Likewise, in slave societies, free African descended people, free people of color, would have identified with a range of racial identities, but they would not have called themselves black, as I said before. They would not have understood themselves that way. They would have thought of themselves as distinct from enslaved people who were described as black. Okay. And when you think about what it would have felt like to be a free person of color in a slave society, this actually makes a lot of sense, right? They need to, as a matter of survival, distance themselves culturally and economically, or they felt the need to, from the enslaved population. And so free people of color within slave societies, they adopted sort of white or European influenced perspectives, and they see no inherent relationship between themselves and other African descended people. And the most important issue in their lives was maintaining that barrier so that they themselves would not fall into slavery. Okay. This dynamic, though, and this is a really important point to take away from today, this dynamic does not exist in the northern United States in the antebellum period. Even though it had once been a society with slaves, it does not follow the patterns of other slave societies in the Atlantic world. There was, for example, one key difference, a tiny population of people of color in the northern United States. This was in only 2 states did the population rise above 10% of the total, right? 10% of the population of New York and Pennsylvania was people of color, and in no other state did it come close to that. In most places, it's about 5% of the total population. In the slave societies of the South and the slave states, the black population could reach as high as 60%. It was frequently as much as 50%, and it was really never lower than about 30%. So you see this dramatic difference, right? African descended people in the United States lived in the South by and large. Very few of them lived in the North. So there's a key difference there. Think about how that difference might affect the ways people of color interact with one another. If you're in a slave society with, say, 55% of the entire population of the region being African descended, there is room within that population for the development of class difference. There's room within that population and a long enough history of that population being there that people in certain groups would try to distance themselves from others, particularly if there's a legal difference in how those people live in the world. If some are free and some are enslaved, they're going to work to develop distance to protect themselves. But in the North, where you have a very small and very concentrated black population, what we see is the development of a unified black identity, right? There's no avoiding the fact that African descended people share a place within Northern society because there's so few of them. And another reason that that happened was because of pressure from the white community, right? White racism in the North did not distinguish African descended people the way perhaps Southern racists did. And because white people controlled all of the major cultural and legal institutions in the society, their perspectives on these issues could matter a great deal. And so white Northerners conflated all African descended people into a single group, which meant that people of color tended to share similar life experiences. They tended to live in similar places. They tended to work in similar places and similar jobs. And that makes sense that they would over time begin to see themselves as sort of sharing a group identity. Okay, so a crucial outcome, just to reiterate that, and this is unlike most other places in the Atlantic world, in the northern states, we see in the antebellum period the origins of an idea of single black identity. Okay, and obviously there's different perspectives within that identity. There's different politics, and there are lots of people who don't get along with one another, and there's competing ideas about what's best for the community. But there's no one who's saying, I'm simply not a member of this group, or I'm of a different race than this group. Okay, we don't see that. Let's talk about, for a few minutes, the conditions of Black life in the North. What were people's lives like? Again, small percentage of the population, rarely more than 5% of the total population, although that did differ in cities, right? Industrializing cities where there was unskilled labor, which is, as I'm going to talk about in just a moment here, one of the few places that African American people could find work. Those jobs tended to concentrate in cities, so those percentages would be a little bit higher in a place like obviously New York or Boston, as well as cities that were big in the 19th century and aren't as big now, like Rochester, New York, or New Bedford, Massachusetts. I think this passage here really sums up the conditions of free Black life. This is from the historian Patrick Rail, who gave us some helpful hints about writing and reading earlier in the semester. He said this: free Blacks in the North lived tenuous lives, undeserving of the adjective free, right? They call it free Black culture, but free is really a sort of weak word to describe what this was, because there are so many conditions attached. But their legal claim to liberty was far more solid than that of free Blacks in any slave society. Okay, so their freedom is deeply conditional, and is often under attack. They have to struggle very hard just to provide the bare necessities of life. And yet, by the letter of the law, there is no experience like this in the Atlantic world. They have greater legal security than any African descended people in the Americas, really. Okay, so there's a conflict there there's a tension between these two realities. Free Black people were marginalized in almost every conceivable way, but they did not live with the same terror that other free people of color, even those who had more economic opportunities, say in New Orleans or Havana or something like that, and could achieve some wealth. Those people still had to live with the terror of being enslaved. By and large, that's not the case in the free North, although that does change a bit in the 1850s with the Fugitive Slave Law, which I'll talk about next week. So I want to review a couple of areas of life and think about how people of color navigated these. I think the most important one, the North is an industrial capitalist society, or it's an industrializing capitalist society in this period. And the most important way to understand the quality of people's lives is to think about their work, their economic position. And free Blacks were almost universally marginalized in the economies of northern states. For most, earning wages for survival was a grueling struggle. It was marked by insecurity, by hostility from white coworkers and bosses, and by low pay. Blacks, as I said a moment ago, tended to occupy unskilled jobs, which were the only ones made available to them. And they were excluded from trade unions, which was a really important way to achieve some economic security, some status, some comfort. To be clear, this didn't necessarily apply to every single free person of color in the North, right? There were exceptions to this. There were people who did ascend to some wealth and influence. We're reading Frederick Douglass this week. He is a great example of this. And even in his first narrative, he writes of arriving in Massachusetts after escaping slavery and saying that he encountered many people of color who had not been 7 years out of their chains and evidently enjoying more of the comforts of life than the average slaveholder in Maryland, right? He's suggesting, look, this is a place where formerly enslaved people have an opportunity to rise. But then in the very next paragraph, Douglass says this: I went in pursuit of a job of caulking. This was his skilled trade. He had learned it in Baltimore, working in shipyards. I went in pursuit of a job, but such was the strength of prejudice against color among the white caulkers that they refused to work with me. And of course, I could get no employment. Right. So on the one hand, we see Douglass saying, oh, Northern society is great. It's a place where a Black man can rise. But then he advances a criticism, recognizing that racial prejudice is actually a real barrier for people of color in the North, and can prevent them from from surviving, really. This kind of conflict was almost an impossible situation to remedy at the time, right? Free blacks are, again, a very small minority of the population in most northern locales. Working class whites were not only not a small minority, they were a large and growing, increasingly majority of the population in many cities. That was growing because there was waves of immigration from Ireland, from Germany, where very large populations of immigrants were coming and increasingly able to influence politics, to access political networks, and to use those to help them find jobs and to prevent competition from infiltrating those jobs, competition as including that of free people of color. Here's how one man, a valedictorian, of his school, framed this situation in 1819. Okay, so this guy is graduating from school in Boston. He clearly is talented and intelligent, and he tells his classmates, it's an all-black school, he says this: "Pardon me if I feel insignificant and weak. What are my prospects? To what shall I turn my hand? Shall I be a mechanic? No one will employ me. White boys won't work with me. Shall I be a merchant? No one will have me in his office. White clerks won't associate with me. Drudgery and servitude, then, are my prospective portion." This man is saying that this sort of booming industrial economy offers no possible opportunities for people of color, no matter their talent, no matter their intelligence. This is an exceedingly grim situation, and this is what applied to the vast majority of people of color in the North throughout the antebellum period. And maddeningly, I think this is the kind of idea that keeps you up at night. The lack of economic access created a situation that fed white Northerners racist ideas about African descended people, right? About people of color. So if there's a racist idea such as blacks being best suited for menial work or sort of dirty, what did he say, drudgery, then seeing African Americans filling those jobs because there are no other opportunities feeds the idea, right? It feeds the stereotype. If there's an idea that the descendants of enslaved people can't exercise personal responsibility and therefore can't have high wages, then seeing African Americans only in jobs where they have no control over their labor, where they have no responsibility, is going to feed the stereotype. In short, this is a sort of replication of a process that we see in slave societies in the South, where you say, oh, the outcome of discrimination, the outcome of exploitation justifies the discrimination or exploitation in the first place, right? It's this circular logic that is sort of insane, but very hard to argue against, and occupies a lot of Black reformers or Black activists' time during this period trying to push against this idea. You can't say that we're not capable of having responsibility if you've never given us an opportunity to exercise responsibility. And this kind of racism flooded into every area of life for free Blacks. And again, this is when the putatively free North is really devising what later becomes known as Jim Crow, which we have historically popularly associated with the South. So I want to talk for a few minutes about some legal segregation, legal marginalization that was very common in the North during this period. Schools. Public schools were a new idea in the antebellum US. They did not exist in all places in the North, but they flourished especially in New England and especially in Massachusetts more than anywhere else, especially by about the 1830s and 1840s. Okay, this is the sort of the beginning of public school movement in the United States. And this is exactly at the same moment that white men without property were beginning to advance in political power in the United States. Prior to this point, important political rights like voting had been determined by property ownership, right? So we have in the 1820s, 1830s, something like what you could call a civil rights movement for white men. And white men achieve at least legal political equality. In this context, most schools begin to serve the children of white men. But they do not, and they refuse to serve black children. And what they're arguing is that black children either don't need a formal education or will somehow ruin the formal education of white students. And they're sort of preying on, again, racist ideas that are very common in the white community. Abolitionists despised this kind of segregation. They argued that not only did it rob children of an opportunity to rise, to advance themselves, and again, we're coming back to this idea, the roads to opportunity are blocked, but abolitionists also argued that school segregation represented a broader form of political exclusion, right? They're saying what you've done is you've created two classes of citizen based on something arbitrary, the color of people's skin. And then you've created different political rights for those groups. That doesn't work in a society that says, according to its constitution, the Massachusetts Constitution, that all men are equal and deserve equal treatment under the law. Another area where we see this is marriage. Many northern states prohibited marriage between white people and people of color. Interracial partnerships were one of the great taboos in American culture at this time. And this was one of the most heated topics of the 1830s and 1840s in the Free North. During the 1830s, you see anti-abolitionists, right, the opponents of racial equality, invoking terms like amalgamation or miscegenation to describe interracial partnerships, and then to describe these things as unnatural or unchristian and deeply immoral, right? They're really working to create sort of moral boundary that will prevent people of color and white people from developing romantic partnerships or getting married. And the real goal here, I think it's fair to say, is to terrify working class white men into caring about interracial partnerships, which they may not have actually cared originally, and by connection, getting them to oppose abolition, right? This is a concern of the Democratic Party, which is allied with the pro-slavery South at the time. And if you're interested in party politics like that, I can talk about that more at another point. And the Democrats were pretty heavily dependent on the white working class and these new immigrants who are coming into the country. And so there's an attempt to sort of build up racial hatred as a way to bridge Northern Democrats with Southern Democrats and get Democratic officials elected to office. So they do things like they invoke concepts like purity, right? The purity of men's daughters, white daughters, or the safety of white wives. And they do this alongside, and you can see this in this image, I think, quite well, racist ideas about the inherent danger and lustfulness of black men, right? So these are the very, very common racist tropes that are in the air at the time. And again, what they're doing is they're creating racist ideas as they go. They're creating racist stereotypes as they go that are going to last for a very, very, very long time and continue really to circulate in our culture. Another area this comes up is in voting. Again, as I said a minute ago, this is an age where voting rights are rapidly expanding to include all white men regardless of property ownership. Those men had been overlooked since the Revolutionary era. They were very angry about that. They were vocal about that. They demanded suffrage. But as they achieved it, states began rewriting their constitutions to make room for these new voters. And this is a sort of strange outcome of this expansion of voting, is that as states revise their constitutions to give more white men the vote, they explicitly, many for the first time, explicitly banned people of color from voting. For example, in 1807, New Jersey granted all white men the right to vote, but in the very same statute explicitly barred black men from ever voting. And prior to that point, if you had been a black man in New Jersey and owned property, you could have voted, right? So there's a loss of voting privilege there. Connecticut does the same thing in 1818. New York does the same thing in 1821, and we see this on and on and on. Not all northern states did this. Massachusetts always granted the right to vote to people of color, to men at least of color. But the majority of northern states did this. And the same thing, by the way, just as a slight aside, the same thing happens with women. There were women in the Revolutionary era period and after who were property owners. Most of them were widows, right? Or perhaps unmarried daughters, and their fathers passed away, and they inherit the property. And with the property, they had the right to vote. So that's another outcome of this process of expanding white male suffrage, with states also explicitly barred women from voting for the first time, many of them for the first time. So this is something I think it's a little difficult to wrap your mind around, because we're so trained to think of history as a sort of progressive story where things tend to get better in steps. But what we see here is, as democracy expands in some areas of American life, for the first time ever, it is explicitly banned for others, right? Others are explicitly left out and unable to participate in any way. And then another area where free blacks feel their marginalization very strongly is in public space generally, but especially in transportation. In this era, people aren't driving around in their own personal cars. Transportation was a very public experience. Streetcars, railroads, steamboats, these are the places where people congregated to get from point A to point B. And in some ways, segregation in public transportation was a thornier and more difficult issue than some of those other areas like marriage and schools and voting. And that's because marriage and school and voting are all government institutions, right? They're all overseen directly by the state. But most transportation in this period was operated by private companies. And private companies would tend to argue that they had a right to organize space on their ship however they saw fit, their ship or their train or whatever it is, however they saw fit. And they had a right to attend to the wishes of their customers. So if white customers did not want to share a rail car or a steamboat with black customers, the companies argued that they had a right to do that. And this remains a thorny issue in the North all through the 19th century, right? It doesn't really disappear. Frederick Douglass is still arguing about this during and after the American Civil War. However, there is an outcome here that I think is important, which is that in response to this kind of segregation, Black communities develop very thoughtful and penetrating criticisms of how these companies do business. This kind of segregation inspires Black reformers to organize their own political groups that can challenge these sorts of things. So it's a moment of political mobilization in the Black community. All of what I've just described, from economic marginalization to legal marginalization, segregation, etc., differed from place to place. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind and, this is an interesting time to think about federalism in America because we've seen such different responses to this virus, right? We see different responses within states, even, never mind from state to state. This is the same thing that's happening during the antebellum period regarding race. So free people of color could do better in some places than others based on the local legal conditions, local economic conditions, and the local political culture. There are some parts of the North that were much more committed to abolition and to racial equality than there were others. Right? This is just like American politics today, where we would say there are conservative regions of the country, liberal regions of the country, et cetera. The same thing is occurring in the North at this time. So the situation changes from place to place. What I just described, though, is sort of a general overview of the main challenges that people faced. So to sum up all of what I just said, we see in the free North, right, particularly after it becomes the free North in this era of gradual emancipation, we see intensifying racial discrimination. And we also see intensifying legal discrimination, right? A lot of these Jim Crow laws that I just described did not exist in the 18th century. They were created after the American Revolution. They're in part a response to the end of slavery. There's no longer a guaranteed position in society for African descended people, right? For people of color. And so states begin creating laws to force those people into submission, even though there's no more slavery. So this is an age of democratic advancement, you could say. It's also an age of incredible legal repression. And yet it's also an age in which, for really the first time in American history, people of color in one region of the country begin to think of themselves as having shared interests and a shared identity that is African American, Black, however you want to describe it. They have a shared identity, and they can use that to defend themselves, and they can use that to advance their political interests. Okay, let's talk about abolitionism for the rest of the lecture here. The most important area of Black politics in the antebellum period was abolitionism. And this is, again, a key difference between free Black communities in the northern United States and free Black communities anywhere else in the Atlantic world. Those who lived in slave societies were not going to criticize slavery because it endangered their own freedom and it could put them in a position where they were themselves enslaved. They didn't want to seem like they had anything to do with enslaved populations. One of the few privileges that free people of color had in the North was that they knew they weren't going to be enslaved, and so they could use that little bit of leverage to very harshly criticize slavery, and they did. They did do that. Black politics in this period is very visible. It's very vibrant. There is an enormous body of literature created by Black reformers in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s that challenges slavery as well as challenges racial injustice in the North. They founded newspapers. They built political associations. They published thousands of pamphlets. They wrote memoirs that were read by hundreds of thousands of people. And they very actively petitioned their governments for redress of the conditions that they faced. And in the process, they developed what we could think of as a political tradition, right? A Black political tradition. And that was rooted firmly in the ideals of the Age of Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, in particular, the ideas of universal rights, of universal human equality, the destruction of hierarchies, the destruction of arbitrary power, right? They take the language that revolutionaries had used against kings 50 years before, and they turn it against white supremacists, right? They turn it against white men who block them from jobs, right? So they're adopting revolutionary rhetoric for new problems. And this is a really important move, right? It sort of bridges that distant world to our own world, politically speaking. For example, here's an example of how they did this. When Black reformers criticized laws against interracial marriage, they were very thoughtful about how they approached this. And they weren't necessarily saying, oh, what we want is more interracial marriage. They weren't even that concerned with the idea of marriage itself, right? They were concerned about what that represented, what a ban on interracial marriage represented. And what they said was, such a law creates, and I said this before with the public schools issue, such a law creates a distinction between citizens on account of complexion. And in doing that, such a law creates a legal hierarchy based on race, in opposition to the ideals of Christianity, in opposition to the ideals of republicanism, of universal equality. And so this is a really crucial point. Black politics force Northern societies to live up to, or to try to live up to, the ideals that they said were most important, right? They're holding Northern society accountable for its stated goals. And again, there's nothing that's more prominent in that than the abolitionist movement. Abolitionism was new, relatively new, in the antebellum period. There are anti-slavery voices in the Atlantic world as long as slavery existed, really. But abolitionism as a sort of distinct, very formalized and very active political movement really takes off in the antebellum period, and there's a few reasons why that happened. One is, as I talked about last week, slavery is just bigger, it's more powerful, and it's more prevalent in American life by this point than it had ever been before. Last week I talked about cotton exports, and I talked about the value of enslaved property in the country and the political power of slaveholders. People in the North noticed that. They couldn't ignore that, and it drove many of them to advance a much harsher critique of slavery. Another cause of the abolition movement's rise was something called the market revolution. And basically what that meant was a series of economic and technological and infrastructural changes, beginning especially in the 18 teens and 1820s, that just bring people's lives so much closer together, even if they live at great distances, right? This is the age of the Erie Canal. It's the age of the first steamboats. It's the age of the first railroads. And those tools just connected people, just as technology tends to do in our lives today. And it made problems that once seemed very distant suddenly seem very immediate. And that made people feel a sense of moral responsibility for things that happened far away from them, right? So you have people in Massachusetts who have much greater moral concern suddenly for the lives of people in South Carolina than they would have at an earlier time. Another cause of this, and these things are all sort of interrelated, is a great sort of religious movement called the Second Great Awakening that sweeps over the country. This is a rapid spread of religious ideas, of new sort of radical religious ideas, an age of Christian revivals, camp meetings, an age of very charismatic religious leadership. This is the age, for example, when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, takes root. It's an age when there are literally hundreds of new religious movements taking off. And every single one of those movements is criticizing American life in one way or another, right? They say, we have to form a new movement because of this problem, or this problem, or this problem. So it's an age of reform. And Americans are very concerned about the moral state of their nation. They're very concerned about alcoholism, about the use of the death penalty. And more than anything, they're very concerned about slavery. And they're worried that slavery will damn their nation and get every one of them sent to hell, essentially, right? And then the last, spark for the abolitionist movement is, of course, as I've already said, free black politics really taking off. Free black politics really concentrating around an identity, all right, and a single African American identity, and because slavery had ended in northern societies, free black people felt empowered to challenge slavery elsewhere. Okay. One point I want to make is that not all abolitionists were the same. Some were fairly conservative. I was kind of saying this at the beginning of the lecture. Some abolitionists were not especially concerned with the welfare of enslaved people. They were concerned instead with the welfare of white America. They were concerned about who would control Western territory, if that'd be slaveholders or non-slaveholders. And some abolitionists were what we call radical abolitionists, and many of them were African Americans, right? And they opposed the idea of colonization that I had talked about last week. Here are some radical abolitionists. This is Frederick Douglass here, sort of center left. When I say opposed colonization, what I mean is they rejected the idea that they should return to Africa because they and their ancestors had been in the Americas for decades and centuries. They imagined a vision of America where free blacks and free whites lived alongside one another equally, where race was not a legal dividing line in American life. Among their number was Frederick Douglass, James McCune Smith, who also was a free African American and a doctor, an extremely distinguished figure in this period. David Walker, who was a pamphlet writer from Boston and died under very mysterious circumstances soon after publishing a scathing critique of slavery in the 1820s. William Lloyd Garrison, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, they were all white people. The Grimkes were actually born into South Carolina Slave Society and migrated north because of their hatred of slavery. So it was an interracial movement, but African Americans tended to fall into the radical camp, right? They're not just concerned about sort of economic issues. They're not just concerned about what will happen to territory in the West. They want to destroy slavery. They see slavery as evil, and they care about the welfare of Black people. As I said, by and large, African Americans disagreed with the idea of returning to Africa. They did not want to leave the land of their birth. David Walker, the radical abolitionist, said, "This country is as much ours as it is the whites, whether they admit it or not," right? They saw themselves as the builders of America, and they weren't going to leave. Walker, as well as Douglass and many other radical abolitionists, believed the only way for Christian America to redeem itself was to attack slavery and inequality, to immediately emancipate all enslaved people, and then enforce their political economy without, or their political equality without question. And what they would say is they demanded immediate, unconditional, uncompensated emancipation. And by uncompensated, they were saying no one should pay slaveholders for emancipating their slaves. Some folks thought, well, we'll end slavery, but we'll pay the slaveholders off, right? So that we don't piss them off too much. Radical abolitionists thought that was a ridiculous idea because they didn't believe in the idea of property in man in the first place, right? That property was illegitimate. You could not do that, and so you can't pay them. In the 1830s, they begin publishing and organizing. The first issue of their newspaper, The Liberator, was published in 1831. Here's a little zoom in on the masthead of The Liberator, which has this really powerful artwork that represents some of their strongest criticisms of slavery. Obviously, front and center, we see Christ returning to earth and freeing the slave, and condemning the slaveholder, right? Christ is saying, I come to break the bonds of the oppressor. On the left over here, we see a slave sale, slaves, horses, and other cattle in lots to suit purchase, right? Reminding Northern audiences of just the absurdity and the evil of commodification. And most issues of the Liberator are available online. You can flip through it very easily in databases that I think are a little bit easier to use, in fact, than say Freedom on the Move. So you can browse through and see what folks were saying in the Liberator. You can see who was advertising in the Liberator, which is always interesting. In 1833, abolitionists organized the American Anti-Slavery Society, which is the first national organization devoted to immediate emancipation. In its Declaration of Sentiments, the American Anti-Slavery Society said, slaveholding is a heinous crime in the eye of God, and the duty, safety, and best interest of all require immediate emancipation. By 1840, so just 7 years after it was formed, it had 200,000 members. That's a lot of people for the size of the population in the North at that time. There were 2,000 local societies. So we see here one from a state branch of the society, from a flyer from the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And they would do these regular mass meetings, bring everybody together. There'd be speechifying. These would be very rousing events. There'd be planning for actions to end slavery. We also see here that they would get railroads on board to convey people to these meetings, if possible. Some railroads obviously would not agree. As I was saying before, we're in this age of Jim Crow. The platform of the American Anti-Slavery Society, it drew on Christian ethics. This is, again, the age of the Second Great Awakening. It depicts slavery as a sin, slaveholding as immoral. Many believed that abolishing slavery would purify the world and invite the second coming of Christ. Again, there you see it. They're not just saying this is going to happen. They're saying this is going to happen because we will it. We're going to make this happen by ending this evil on earth. The United States in the 19th century is a deeply Christian society. Christianity runs through every single facet of life in the US at this time. It's really important to keep that in mind in ways that people at the time, I think, took for granted, and that are hard for us to understand just how deeply Christian ethics and Christian imagery and myth and these sorts of things were woven into everyday life. They preached nonviolence, radical abolitionists in the American Anti-Slavery Society. They preached nonviolence, and they were experts at using technology to advance their ideas, right? They published almanacs, they published advertisements, they hosted anti-slavery fairs, and they used sort of unique printing techniques to get people's attention like this. They published a significant amount of children's literature so that children could learn the evils of slavery from a young age. And by the way, pro-slavery advocates in the South published counter literature that would teach Southern children the wonders and good of slavery. And the most important, I think, technique that they used, certainly the most visible to us today, was the slave narrative. And you basically have one of those down at least, right? Because you watch 12 Years a Slave. Solomon Northup's original 12 Years a Slave is one of the classic slave narratives. It's one of the classic memoirs of slavery. Another is the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And the second sort of version of that story, called My Bondage and My Freedom, which you're reading this week coming up. There were more than 100 slave narratives published before the Civil War. They were very affordable, very cheap, intentionally so that white families could easily access them, could easily come to understand what slavery was like. And they read them voraciously. White Northerners read these books obsessively, and it really grew the numbers of the abolitionist movement. It's sort of like it's best understood as a distinct literary genre in the 19th century. It's one of the great American contributions to world literature, right? And slave narratives followed sort of prescriptive themes, themes like sexual violence and exploitation. We see this with Patsy in 12 Years a Slave. Torture, right? We see torture all through that narrative, and that shows up in just about every slave narrative. Family separation is essential, right? A Christian society like the Northern United States valued very much the relationship between parents and children, especially mother and children. And so it was important for formerly enslaved people when writing their stories to emphasize that separation. Frederick Douglass's first memoir begins with his separation from his mother and dwells on it repeatedly. Another theme was the impact of slavery on whites, that it would turn them into these sort of evil, maniacal devils. And I think we see that, especially with Michael Fassbender in 12 Years a Slave playing Edwin Epps, right? He's psychotic. And that's very much what Solomon Northup intended to show in his original narrative. Frederick Douglass describes one of his slaveholders, a woman named Sophia Auld, A-U-L-D, as this deeply Christian woman who begins teaching him to read, but then is instructed by her husband in the ways of slavery, and she learns to think like a slaveholder, and she punishes him if she catches him reading, and as he puts it, she turns into a sort of demon, right? The argument here is slavery will turn you into the devil if you benefit from it, if you think you benefit from it. Another theme is the resilience of enslaved people, right? Their stamina, their ability to survive these horrors and keep going and try to strive towards freedom. And then their ability and their willingness, if emancipated, to embrace middle-class norms of family, of industry, of Christianity. In other words, what the authors were saying is, if slavery ends, little will actually change in the society, right? We are fully capable and desirous of becoming middle-class people, just as many whites were striving to become in the North at the same time. This is why 12 Years a Slave ends the way it does. Okay, Northup is suggesting, despite the horrors of slavery, he can still return to his family and be what many Northerners would see as a sort of normal person, right? So it's an attempt to sort of attract Northern audiences based on their values. Abolitionists were always a minority. This is a really important point to keep in mind. I think when we talk about the Civil War era in particular, we tend to think, oh, everybody in the North hated slavery and was an abolitionist, and everybody in the South loved slavery and was pro-slavery. And so they had to go to war with each other. But that wasn't really the case. And abolitionists struggled to advance their cause. They often faced violence. They often faced surveillance from the government. Not as sophisticated as what you might see today, but nonetheless, it was there. In some cases, they were murdered, white and black abolitionists alike. But they were a growing minority, and they were advancing quite a bit of political influence over this new political party, the Republicans, by the 1850s. Next week, we're going to get more into that story. We're going to talk about how abolitionists evolved as the Civil War approached, how they began to sort of give up on the idea of nonviolence and began turning towards some more violent tactics to advance their cause, as well as how they were opposed by pro-slavery advocates in the South. But I just want to talk quickly as I wrap up here about legacies. The most important legacy, I think, of free black communities in the North, and certainly of the abolition movement, is obviously abolition itself, right? Slavery ends in large part because there is a concentrated and powerful political movement that's dedicated to ending it for decades. But that's not the only legacy. And I think it's very possible to trace later political developments in American life, 20th century political movements from the Black Power movement to the sort of nonviolent civil rights movement, both of which are in the 60s and into the early 70s, as well as the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, to trace those in some ways back to free Black communities in the North, this very small minority of people who were able to forge a new group identity around their Africanness, their Blackness, right, for the first time ever in American history, and to challenge the rest of the society to live up to its ideals of equality, to live up to its ideals of democracy. And so it's this period, right? This is such an important turning point that we're talking about here. It's this period where we see Black politics emerge for the first time. We see people of color come to view their discrimination and their inequality as a shared burden that requires the integration of their identity and the mutual support of one another to overcome it. And then on the sort of dark side of this, of course, this is also the era where we see things like segregation and various forms of legal inequality really taking root and becoming more and more sophisticated. So this week, we're going to read the most famous, I would say the most famous person of this era, and certainly the most famous African-American of this era, Frederick Douglass. It's very likely that Douglass was at various points in his life the most famous man in the world, or one of the most famous men in the world. And he is, one of a handful of 19th century Americans who still have a great hold on our culture. Abraham Lincoln's probably the other who's right there with him. But Douglass is very much a sort of figure of the period that we're talking about. And I chose the sections of his second memoir that focus on life in the North, right? Much of his writing had to do with life as a slave. He was born as a slave. But I chose these chapters in particular so we could get his perspective on living in so-called free society, as well as some of his perspective on traveling abroad, traveling to Europe, and what it meant to be an African American in Europe in this period, and how different it was from his expectations, and what sort of light it shone on the United States, which thought of itself as an exceptional and free place. Okay, so I'm looking forward to talking about all of this with you soon. Bye, everybody. Thanks for watching.